is some threshold over which people can't quite deny what's happening in front of their faces anymore. But it is a profound, almost existential threat to a democracy, I think. This breakdown in trust and the breakdown in the way that we collectively form our knowledge about the world.
The role of news in society is, I'll go back to Kovach and Rosenstiel and the elements of journalism. They define journalism as the process of giving citizens the information they need to be free and self-governing. And I think that that's probably the most important role of journalism.
To provide sufficient information for a democratic polity to make informed choices about self-governance.
Remember, media means in between. It's transmitting the culture to a group of people who can't physically talk to each other anymore.
We've always been united and we've always been divided. United as a species, but divided culturally, divided in many other ways, perspectives, factions, religions, mindsets, and so forth.
Today we have this just bewildering sort of anxiety of choice when it comes to information. You end up having the news just sort of slip its way into your sphere. But sometimes that could be lots of really bad information. That could be an extremely skewed vision of the world.
You know, I think the public is really not that trusting of the media anymore. And you see that throughout, no matter what your political beliefs are, because the media is almost becoming part of the problem.
One guy is saying it's pouring outside. The other guy is saying it's completely sunny outside. And that's the end of the story. Well, a real journalist pokes his or her head out of the window and says, well, no, actually, you know, it is sunny, or it's pouring, or it's drizzling. It's not enough to say, here's what Nancy Pelosi says, and here's what the Donald Trump tweet says, and then wash your hands and feel, because you've reflected two elite opinions, that you've given a full story. You haven't. That's not democracy.
I would say the media has a big impact on elections, you know, ever since, you know, like the 1960 campaign, which had the first televised presidential debates. I think today we're seeing the rise within social media. So it brings a whole nother component to a political campaign.
A democracy cannot function without a functioning free press. When information can be suppressed by the government, by corporate powers, by the military, you no longer have a free society. People cannot vote in an informed and meaningful way.
The erosion of trust is really dangerous for democracy. We can't, I mean, fundamentally, we cannot get knowledge outside of trust relationships. Everything we know basically comes from a trust relationship. When that trust breaks down, and particularly when it gets balkanized into different sort of centers, then you have a really hard time building any kind of basic societal consensus to produce democratic change.
I noticed that my students and my colleagues and so forth were so saturated that when people came to me, I could say, there's CNN, there's Huffington Post, there's Fox, rather than any kind of independent thinking. So from an intellectual standpoint, it's much more important for people to be free of their programming.
When I put the TV on, I kind of immediately, I already know what the MSNBC and their little team, I already kind of know what their view is going to be. Their view is 100% anti-Trump, 100% anti-Republican.
Fox is the right wing, CNN is the center, and MSNBC is the left. MSNBC itself is less liberal now than it is resistance. So they have a lot of conservatives who are there because they don't like Trump.
I do not trust CNN and MSNBC because they are so soft on the corporate centrists. I've worked at all of the three cable news channels. I've seen them from the inside. The one that isn't even a news channel is Fox News.
All journalism, all speech is bias. And the question is it a bias you can trust?
Every media outlet constructs narratives because that's the way that humans communicate. It's just almost impossible to get away from that. I mean, storytelling is so intrinsic to human communication. The earliest forms of human writing are essentially ledgers of accounts and then stories. So you can lay out the facts, but even if you tried to lay out the facts in a non-narrative way, you would inevitably bend towards some sort of narrative. So narrative construction is inevitable, and I think also useful, because narratives are the way that we tend to come and understand the world. The problem is that when you kind of subvert the complexity and the facts to the dominant story you're telling, and that's a real danger, and it happens all the time when relevant facts are left out because they don't kind of fit the narrative thrust of a story you're trying to tell. But those two things, like just presenting the facts and telling a story, are in a sort of constant, dynamic, unresolvable tension.
It's very hard to change anyone's mind about anything. If you give them facts that contradict the narrative they have in their heads, they either ignore the facts or they find a way to fit them in. Can anyone be objective? No. Objectivity is impossible because people are unaware of their biases. And the pose of objectivity is itself a bias. I'm not interested in objectivity, I'm interested in truth. So I think people should try as hard as they can to get to the truth, even if the truth grows out of a bias, what other people would call a bias. So I think we're losing objectivity as a goal in journalism, and I'm fine with that.
Humans tend to think more like lawyers rather than scientists, right? So a lawyer has the position they need because of the client they're representing, and then they fill in the facts to justify it, to make an argument. That's what we tend to do as humans. We don't tend to think like scientists, which is a sort of radical skepticism about what the outcome is and then wait until all the data comes in. And that means that we're just sort of designed to have this sort of, confirmation bias, these sort of tribal instincts towards finding information that we like and disregarding information we don't like. And one of the important parts of a good education, of good news consumption, of being part of a civic democracy, is developing the habits of thought and mental rigor that push against those natural inclinations we have.
Both narratives about, are the media too liberal, are they too, it's pointless. The media, you need to do a structural analysis. The media are too corporate, that's the problem. The mainstream media is in a sort of a complicity with the corporate political system of the two major parties.
The Republicans and Democrats are almost bankrupt after an election. They have to pour millions of dollars into advertising. Who inherits all of that money? The media. So the media actually ends up quite rich and the parties end up relatively poor, and that's why they have to go immediately out and do more fundraisers. No one seems to understand this, but everything is totally different than it looks like on the surface. And because the media benefit from that, they're not very likely to help us be educated about that.
The dirty little secret of newspapers, even to this day, is that if you want to cut enough, you can make a pretty good profit. But at that point, you're not serving the information needs of the community. But they've attained some measure of profitability while maintaining a good journalistic product, because regional papers are a really difficult problem. I hope that they'll stand as examples of how you can, just by kind of sticking with it and trying different things, return newspapers to profitability without cutting them so deeply that they're not able to do important journalism.
People don't think critically. People think comfortably. So they want news that's comfort food rather than news that's hard to digest.
That's the idea behind the newspaper. Newspaper is an informational meal kit. They select what stories should be in there and what stories should be left out. It's all arranged, and what you got to do is just sit down and read the newspaper, because some editor somewhere decides this story isn't important and this one is, and you have no way of getting the story that gets left on the cutting room floor.
In some ways, the press is better than it ever was today, and in a lot of ways it's worse, but the people in it haven't really changed.
Media literacy should be taught from, first grade. And it would be, you'd begin with, what is this TV commercial trying to get you to believe? And so, you need to teach this in public schools all the way through, from the beginning.
Media literacy, I think, is important for students, and starting to question and debate. And I think this allows them to formulate their own opinions. As teachers, we're not trying to indoctrinate them into a certain way of thinking. What we're trying to show them is, here's what's happening. Let's see, what are the pros, what are the cons, what are the consequences of doing this, what are the consequences of not doing it, and so on. And at least we get kids thinking, and then you're free to come up with your own opinion.
In the absence of a technology, you find out what that technology does to the environment. So for example, if you have a blackout in New York, the absence of electricity teaches you a whole lot about what we're dependent on. So by virtue of that, a media fast helps us realize all the things that media is doing, both pro and con and neutral, for us.
There are news records that you can hold up about news organizations to see whether they're reliable or not. And you should sort of evaluate that in those terms.
At NewsGuard, we don't use the term fake news because it's been abused by so many different people to categorize anything they don't agree with. We use misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is stuff that's just wrong, and disinformation is propaganda, stuff you're really on purpose making wrong. We use journalists, trained journalists, 36 of them, and experienced editors to read the 2,000 plus websites responsible for all the news and information consumed online in the United States and write ratings of them. And with the rating, the red and green for each of the criteria, we publish a nutrition label which explains exactly why we did what we did, what our reasoning is, and everything is totally transparent.
I would say that getting the truth is hard work. It's hard work for the journalist and it's hard work for the reader. And that's why trust is so important.
It has never been easier to find good quality truth-telling news than it is today. We are awash in it.
And the tragedy of modern society, the tragedy of an overly mediated, overly saturated media society, is that consumption becomes so easy that people begin to slip into mind control mode.
I think you have to remember that there are different sources that are coming from different places, and the idea that you know the source of your news, that you trust particular people because you know their methods, you know who those people are and where they have come from. I think as long as you have that background information, you're going to be able to trust at least in some of the news and figure out where you can get news that is meaningful to you and helps you live your life and helps us live a life in a republic.
The quality is right in front of you. Take advantage of it.